Hey, what's up? I'm Matt. I run Hacienda Mastering. We have a new plugin that is either out now or is about to be out, depending on how quickly I get this video edited and when you're seeing it. But yeah, it's here or about to be here, and there's no better time to do a little demo to introduce you to what it can do. Um, Murkury was kind enough to donate a track for me to mess with through it. Thank you, Alec, for that. It's a big sub forward kind of wall of sound bass track. Real aggressive, real forward. And I think that's one of the things that Sema really excels at, among others. So it's a good place for us to start with these demo videos. If you aren't a bass engineer or producer, don't worry. I've got a good variety coming, but I wanted to put it down for my community with the first video. So yeah, you get a fat bass track for the first one. So with that out of the way, let's hit play. And mind the latency. All right, so this is a very dynamic mix. Let's do something about that by turning up the input gain into clipping. Okay. Now we're 8.5 dB louder than we were before. No big deal. So in the default settings of Sema, we have a little bit of saturation cooked in because we really feel that the saturation works hand in hand with the clipping on this device to get you the best results out of it. There's a sort of yin and yang between the two, and every song has a different sweet spot for it. I like to think of it in terms of clipping, bringing the image closer to you, the front of the sound stage closer to you, and the saturation works to swell the back of the sound stage towards the front. So you attack it from the top and also from the bottom up, and that's kind of the magic. Let's add in a little saturation here. I'm going to just turn this saturation knob up, and here's what it does. That's nice. So, Sema is not your garden variety loudness tool. I guess every developer says that. But ours has an interesting quirk about it that's adopted in from the hardware we modeled, where as you boost into it, into more clipping, and especially as you add saturation, you see how it's sort of tucking in the upper spectra a little? This loudness tool gets subbier and warmer and fatter as it gets louder. I find that most loudness tools kind of do the opposite. They get harsher and thinner and more abrasive as you get louder. We wanted ours to kind of do the opposite of that. Just to put that in mind for you. So anyway, I've added my clipping, I've added my saturation, but the kick's getting a little dirty here, and that's a consequence of the gain staging from the clipper into the saturator that follows it in the chain in this plugin. So let's adjust the coarse drive control that affects the gain staging out of the clipper into the saturation. And in order to do that, you need to get into the advanced panel, which can be accessed by clicking on our cheeky little Hacienda logo in the bottom left corner there, okay? So here we find our drive control, right? This is just a gain stage that happens in between clipping and the saturation that follows it. I'm gonna knock it down a little bit and listen to the difference here. So here's at 0, where we were. And if we go to just here, it keeps the kick a little punchier and keeps it a little cleaner. So I'm going to go with that. Now, you're probably wondering, could I have just turned the saturation down a little and left this alone? Maybe, but not always. I find that sometimes you get the right amount of like subbloom and kind of, forward swell of the sound stage with the right saturation setting, and then you can refine it a little with the drive. Now, our drive control here, let me A-B it for you so you can hear the difference. And let me introduce our A-Bing system as I do so. So I have made settings here. When I hit this A-B button, what it does is it copies the setting into both the A and B states and then switches to the opposite state. So as I switch back and forth now, nothing changes. But if I go and alter a parameter, if I say right click on this control and type in 0 to put it back where it was, you can right click on any control in this plugin and enter your own specific values with fairly high resolution. So I've saved 0 drive into the A state. You see that the A side is illuminated. And when I switch to B, we go to this drive setting. And listen to the difference in the kick presentation when I switch between the two of these. Oops, I just broke it. Let me put that back. There we go. Okay. So here's without taking the drive down a little. Okay, and here's with the drive down a little. Without. And with. The general rule of thumb with Sema is the more clipping you intend to get away with, the less saturation and the less drive into saturation you'll probably want to use in the interest of keeping it, cleaner from perceived distortion, audible distortion. So the drive range by default on this plugin is very broad. And we did that with the intention of making it more accessible to sound designers. But if you're specifically a mastering engineer, you'll probably want more granular control. And in order to set that, you can change the range of the drive. In order to do so, you have to click on the word advanced or the hamburger next to it, which opens the advanced menu. Okay, and this is for the real heads. Now in this first tab, System Config, it says Drive Slider Range. And in this contextual menu, there's 3 options. Plus or minus 24, which is good for sound designers. Plus or minus 5, which is good for mix engineers. And plus or minus 1, which is probably going to be just right for most mastering engineers. So now, as I move this control, it encompasses a much smaller range, which means that, with my mouse or with my knob controller that I use, I have better resolution that I can dial into. So it's a little bit less clunky for mastering uses. Okay, so there's that. All right, let's talk about unlink. So we have this control, going back to the main panel here, called stereo unlinking. And effectively what it does is it allows you to soften the difference in asymmetry that is inherent to the device under test that we based this plugin off of. So for the plugin doctor, let me just open the Trinov app real quick. Moving on. If I open up the unlink on here from where it defaults at 100% to 200%, you see a disparity coming for the signal that plug-in doctor is passing through it. You bring it down to 100, you get your symmetry back. There are problems you see and there are problems that you hear. And for me, I generally like to retain as much mix width and augment it as much as possible. So for me, I'm usually hanging out at 200%, which is closer to what the hardware does naturally. I find it increases the overall scale of the soundstage, the height, the breadth of it. I find that the edges of the image bleed into the far distant sides, around my head more so than if I hung out closer to 100%. I'll give you a little A/B. And for those of you on headphones, this may not be like an earth-shattering difference, but for those of you on speakers in a good monitoring environment, I think you'll appreciate it. Okay, so here's 100% unlink, the default. And here's 200%. Okay, 100%. And 200%. Okay? So, again, depending on your monitoring environment, that may or may not be an earth-shattering difference to you, but I like to keep it as open as possible, just personal preference. That said, there are a lot of cases where I will want to relink the stereo by differing degrees. The main case in which I would want to do that is where I explicitly want to trade a little bit of stereo width for a slightly more coherent center image. If I have a big, main vocal or a really prominent mid bass, like this track kind of has, I may want to draw this in a little bit. And when you do that, it does a couple things. One of the things that it does is it removes some of the asymmetry from the clipping and saturation profile. It creates a better unified mono clipping and saturation content. And in that, from the harmonics being generated from the clipping and saturation, you can oftentimes create a more holographic center image in the middle of your mix than in a lot of the imaging tools I've messed with. I find it does it in a really interesting way that can be very compelling if you get the right amount of it done. If you overdo it, you're going to narrow your mix. You're going to put it in a box as opposed to keeping it big and open. But you're going to get stronger center image cohesion. So depending on your motivating factors on a given master, you're going to want to mess with this to some degree. All right. Hopefully I've demystified that well enough to get started. So, this mix is feeling a little sublight, which, is absolutely something that I would say. But let's add a little. All right. So we have a pair of shelves on Sema. You have the controls for the first shelf up here. This shelf happens prior to clipping and saturation. There is a second low shelf that compensates it. It de-emphasizes and re-emphasizes, if you will, on either side of the clipping and saturation. And the controls for the Q and the center frequency are ganged between those two shelves. And the gain control for the low shelf is inverse compensated. So as I cut bass on the way into the plugin, it boosts bass on the output of the plugin. Okay? And what that does is it lets you prune back some of your sub content and some of your sub level, and preserves the dynamics of it and doesn't chew it up as badly through clipping, so that you can clip harder without it screwing up the low end. And then you can re-add those low end dynamics and the degree of bass weight that you want in what comes out of the plugin afterwards. Okay, so the gain control for the front end shelf is here. And if we go to the advanced panel and click this down arrow here, we'll see LS recovery, which stands for low shelf recovery. This is what we call the recovery shelf that is on the back end of the plugin. Okay, it defaults to 100%, which means if I turn this down by a dB, it's going to turn the recovery shelf up by a dB. And if we go into Plugin Doctor and have a look, you'll see that in the default settings, I make a change here. Oops, I've changed them. In the default settings, as I make a change, nothing really happens here because the shelves are behaving the way they're supposed to be and compensating for each other. And what that gives you on the output is a phase coherent response that lets you control how much low end you want to clip and saturate in Sema versus how much do you want to let go out of the other side of Sema and either control with a limiter so you can blend between how much your bass is being managed by Sema versus a limiter after it. Or you can simply just turn your output gain down and balance your recovery shelf against that output gain so that you have control of your low end versus the rest of the spectra on what is spit out by the plugin, if that makes sense. Okay, so when I turn this recovery shelf down to 0%, it's now been removed from the circuit. So as I cut more, that is reflected. And as I boost more, that is reflected. Okay. Now I do 1 dB here. If I do, say, 50%, we get a half dB back because it's re-adding 50% of what I did on the other side. Okay. If this is set to, well, I guess I've gone through all the cases. Now look at what happens if I go the other way. If we cut and fully recover, we get nothing. If we go down to 0, we get a cut. And we have shades in between, which let us control exactly how much sub we're driving out of the output of the clipper, agnostic to how much bass you're sending into it. And that can be a really useful ergonomic tool for rebalancing your sub range against the rest of the mix. Okay, so let's turn up into it so you can see how much sub this thing can handle. I'm going to turn it up compensated, and then I'm going to turn the compensation off afterwards so you can hear the difference, okay? So I'm going to boost this, and then post-clipping and saturation, it's going to pull it back, all right? And then I'm going to use the amount of recovery to add more of the sub back, to inversely recover less of it, if that makes sense. Here we go. I'm going to set my frequency first. I happen to know that 120 lands the filter into a nice slope that gets the right amount of phase shift on the fundamental of the kick and the first harmonic of the kick. I'm also going to set this to 0.8, which between you and me, I think is the punchiest Q factor on the plugin, but that's just me. So anyway, let's add sub-level. Compensated. Okay? So we're not hearing much yet because it's being compensated. Alright? Now, I'm going to hit play again and I'm going to turn the recovery shelf down and listen to what happens when I do that. You hear the pressure coming forward? That's that recovery shelf going back up to unity. Now, we are simply boosting a low shelf into the front end of the clipping and saturation and doing nothing on the back end of it, letting it do its thing, okay? Not too complicated or scary, right? Still sounds to me like the kick's getting a little bit chewed up here. So let's get into another feature of Sema, and that is the DC filter. Any A to D converter that you go into is going to have a DC filter. Whether it's defeatable on the hardware or not depends on the model in question. But there are some cases where a DC filter is beneficial. If you need to trim a little bit of infra weight off your master, it's great for that. But sometimes if you're going really screamingly loud, the phase shift of the DC filter can impact frequencies high enough into the sub-range where it starts to phase rotate the partials of your kick drum. And when it phase rotates them and puts those partials slightly out of phase with each other, it increases the duration of the distortion event that happens when you clip and saturate it. And it makes it more audible to the end listener. So there are times when you're going super screaming loud where you might want to get rid of your DC filter. And fortunately, we were smart enough to include that option on this plugin. So let's A/B with and without the DC cut. Here's with the existing DC cut in the default settings. And here's without. Okay. With the DC. And without. We lose just the littlest bit of forward emphasis in the kick. But I think that's okay in this case because it cleans it up enough to fit my preferences for this master, all right? Depending on what you're trying to do, you may want to use the DC cut or not use it. That phase rotation can be very beneficial in a lot of cases to change the presentation of the sub. Sometimes that phase rotation can push the lowest note in the sub a little forward if you put it in the right frequency. Sometimes it can push the kick a little forward if you put it at the right frequency. We give you the ability to dial that in on here, all right? But in addition to the low end, where you expect there to be a sonic impact of the DC filter, listen to the change in the high frequencies when I switch between DC cut out and DC cut in. Here's out. Listen to the hats. And here's with the DC cut in. Without. You hear the hats come forward a little bit when the DC cut's enabled? I sure do. So be mindful of that too. There are ramifications far beyond the bass range that come into play when you start including or excluding a DC filter from a circuit. So keep that in mind, all right? On this particular master, I also opted out of circuit artifacts. I wanted to make this as maximally big and forward as possible, and I needed as much headroom as possible for that. So I'm omitting the circuit artifacts, which takes us from here to here. With circuit artifacts and without circuit artifacts. You hear the kick and the sub coming forward a little bit when I turn them off? That isn't on every master. On quite a few masters, you get more punch having the circuit artifacts turned on. But on this particular one, I feel like it maintains a little bit better dynamics in the low end and gives it a slightly more forward presentation. But that's going to depend on the song big time, okay? If you want to get more hands-on about dialing in the circuit artifacts, you can go to the Advanced menu by clicking on the word Advanced and going to the Circuit Artifacts tab. If you have circuit artifacts on, this page will become modifiable. I'm going to get more into this in future videos where I am using circuit artifacts, but you get a lot of control over the parameters of the specific analog environment that you're sending your signal through. Anything from, mains voltage drift of the hardware that's being modeled with different drift characteristic models, different amounts of differential nonlinearity, as well as two different models for differential nonlinearity, and a couple other options that I'll get into in future videos. But for this one, I'm going to keep this guy off, okay? So let's get into another really exciting feature of this plugin, which is called Resolve. And it can be found in the Advanced menu in the bottom right down here. I'm going to hit play and I'm going to start turning this up and have a listen. You hear the grit of the mid bass kind of come forward as I add this, the tiny little details in the distortion of the mid bass just comes forward a little bit. This is a brand new thing that we're introducing that I don't think anybody has ever put into a plugin before. I'm not at a huge amount of liberty to say what exactly it does under the hood, but its job is to extract low-level detail and bring it forward in a way that is peak level and loudness agnostic. Sort of an answer to parallel compression that doesn't come with time constants, doesn't come with distortion incurred by it, doesn't incur dynamic range change. It sounds too good to be true, but try it out on some mixes. See what you think of it. We're big fans of it. And it has 3 engines that can be accessed in the advanced controls in system config. There's the standard engine, which I'm using on this, deep, which I think kind of focuses more specifically on the low end than the rest of the spectra. Standard embellishes everything to a certain degree. Deep is more specific into the low end of my ear, and extreme is a more exaggerated model of resolve that works on some things and ruins other things. But those are the 3 types of it that you can use differing amounts of with the resolve control. Okay, cool. So let's talk about divergence. Divergence is one of those interesting little quirks that we found by parameterizing something that we intended to leave cooked in under the hood. But as I started messing with it, I saw a lot of potential for it to be dialed in on specific songs. So we made it user accessible. What this kind of does is trades a little bit of width and it trades a little bit of localization strength for center channel focus. It can really draw out whatever the feature of your song is. And on some songs, it'll only take a little. On some songs, it'll take more. If you've got a big lead vocal you want to feature on a track that just isn't well enough revealed in the mix, this might be worth experimenting with. So let me turn this up a little and listen to what it does to the mid bass. Here's without. And here's with. Without. And with. You hear how the mid bass gets a little better focused when I do that? It kind of draws it forward out of the image a little. That's kind of what you're going for here with this control. Okay. So we haven't even gotten into our Nyquist settings. We should dial in our Nyquist settings. We are right now at the default Nyquist settings, which is a IIR Chebyshev filter, which is, we believe, what the model under test used in its topology, but we give you the ability to use a couple different filter shapes. On the IIR page, you have a Chebyshev, and the shape of it is modeled here. You have a Butterworth, and as you can see, the curve changes as you switch. This previews the shape of your filter, both the DC cut and the Nyquist filter. Now, if we hit FIR, we get into our FIR Nyquist filter selection, which is Kaiser and apodizing. Okay, I want to use Kaiser on this. Let me switch you back and forth between Chebyshev and Kaiser so you can kind of hear the difference. Here we go. And Kaiser. Chebyshev. Kaiser. For me, Kaiser is a really good filter on this for really modern, really forward music. It doesn't embellish the breadth of the image in any particular way, but it does create a really nice center cohesion that can just make things a little more direct, a little more focal than the IIR options can. I also really like apodizing, which is the other FIR option. I'll A/B those for you. Here's Kaiser again. And here's apodizing. Kaiser. And apodizing. To my ear, the Kaiser's a little more direct. It's a little more center focused. The apodizing does a little bit more of this. It romanticizes the image a little, and in exchange, it softens the transient attacks a little bit. So it's a little less direct, but on some stuff, it does really nice things for the image. I usually bounce back and forth between Kaiser and apodizing right now, but your mileage may vary. We gave you all the options you need to figure out what works best for you, okay? And it will vary on a song-by-song basis, which is why we've included it. But your ability to design the Nyquist filter of your virtual A to D converter doesn't end there. If you refer down here, we have 4 parameters, and these are all Nyquist related. There's the transition width, which controls the width of the crossover, or the slope of the thing. We then have passband ripple, which allows us to make a steeper transition width, and then we have stop band rejection, and all of those are reflected here. For this, I'm going to go for an optimal filter, I think, because I want it to be maximally forward and maximally pure to the mix, and the phase angle be damned. I can live with that on this. So I've set passband or transition width to minimum, steep as possible, passband ripple as small as possible, minimal ripple, and maximum stop band attenuation. So it's kind of an ideal filter here. And those settings are carried as you switch between shapes of Nyquist filters to make it easier to A/B. Up here you have your Nyquist filter cutoff, which lets you control how much high frequency bandwidth you're allowing into the master. Sometimes changing the center frequency of this slightly will move a hi-hat harmonic away from the knee of the Nyquist, and it'll make it a lot more polite without having to mess with a high frequency EQ somewhere else in your master and screwing something up, okay? That's worth keeping in your pocket for a rainy day. Sometimes it gets me out of trouble, all right? Moving right along, let's talk about dynamic bias, which is what most of this cluster over here in the advanced controls is responsible for. What it is a band that has user configurable attack and release settings. Attack is here, release is here. I'm going to set this to 100 because 100 is my go-to number on this plugin for kick drum punch. I think it's the sweet spot for the envelope we designed for this, okay? So I've set the attack and release time of my dynamic band. Target frequency lets you select the center of where this band is, that you're either going to use to do downward compression or upward expansion, depending on where you put the intensity knob. If you turn the intensity knob down, it downward compresses on the input before it goes into the clipper and the saturator, and then it does the opposite of that with a second band after the saturation stage to restore the dynamics that you're tucking in order to sneak them through clipping and saturation without distortion, okay? So in default settings, it compensates on the other side, same way that the low shelf does, all right? Now, if you hit the up arrow here, you get to the recovery control. This controls the recovery for dynamic bias. So right now, I have it fully recovering what I'm compressing right here on the other side. So those dynamics are returned into the signal on the back end of the clipping and saturation. If I don't want it to compensate, I can just turn the recovery down to 0. If I want it to add more dynamics back than I took out with the dynamic bias, I turn it up past 100. And then you get more dynamics coming out of Sema than you had going into it in the low end. And you would probably be hard-pressed to name another clipper on the market that can make your low end more dynamic post-clipping than pre-clipping. So that's a good one to keep in your back pocket. I'm hoping you're getting a picture of the kind of landscape here. Dynamic bias for me is a kick control utility. I use it to tuck the kick in enough to keep it from distorting, or sometimes to push the kick up above the sub level and have a louder kick level in the mix than the sub is, to change the balance between the two. And then the two recovery bands give you the ability to balance your overall sub level with LS recovery versus your dynamic band recovery independent of each other. So with recovery, LS recovery, and the output gain, you can dial in how much kick you want, how much sub you want, and how much of the rest of the mix you want coming out of the plugin. Okay? It lets you control all three of those in one place with these tools, if you know what you're doing. Okay? So let me... I'm going to boost the intensity because Alec tends to have a little bit shy of kicks in his mixes. So I'm going to help those out a little bit. And I'm going to do a little bit of recovery. But on this one, where we're pushing a ton of sub pressure out of the master, and we want to maintain a lot of that sub pressure, I'm doing a little trick that you're able to do with dynamic bias, which is where you emphasize the kick into the clipping and saturation, and then you slightly de-emphasize it on the back end with a little bit of recovery. And what that does is it pockets your kick into the subnote. The envelope of the dynamic bias kind of detaches the kick a little bit from the rest of the sub level and defines it. Even when you have an absolutely astronomical shit ton of sub level that you're trying to push in your master, it creates a definition that creates the impression of punch, even though what it's actually doing is pulling back the dynamics of the kick on the back end. It's a little trick you can do. I'll show you the difference. Here's with no recovery. Well, let me show you what it sounds like as I add a little bit of upward expansion on the kick into this feature. Let me make the rest of my settings real quick. Looks good. All right, here we go. Here's no dynamic bias. here's a little bit. Okay. Did you hear the kick get punchier? That's the idea. That's what we're going for here. Okay. So now I'm going to do a little bit of recovery in order to keep the kick from breaking up as badly on output. In order to keep it clean, I'm going to have it compensate with a little bit of downward compression on the kick post saturation and clipping. Okay, here we go. Here's no recovery, full level. Okay, so did you hear the kick get punchy again? That is not because there's more kick level coming out of the master. That is specifically because I'm creating a pocket in the sub pressure where the level briefly goes down for the kick. The dynamic of the kick goes slightly down compared to the mix. But in doing so, it creates this little envelope pocket that features the kick and, so far as my feet can tell, gets the subwoofers to energize a little more into the room. They push a little bit more impulse into the room. I get a little bit more punch off of it, even though what we're doing is objectively taking away kick level. Creating that definition creates the impression of greater punch if you dial it in just right. And that's what you're able to do here with this plugin. Okay. All right. So we are really getting down there on this one. Let's get into Transient Guard, which is the last feature I really want to talk about in this first demo video. There will be many more following it, but okay, so as you push into clipping and as you push into saturation, the clipping and the wave shaping of the processing is naturally going to erode upper frequency information from the waveform as it becomes dominated by the longer wavelength, higher intensity, low frequency energy that's being pushed through the clipping and saturation, right? It's a natural consequence of doing it. Well, we've decided to give you the ability to recover some of that detail that's being clipped and wave shaped out of the outcome of the master, all right? And in order to get there, you go to Advanced. You go to Advanced by clicking on Advanced, and then you go to Transient Separation tab. That brings you here. Now, if you turn this on, it will turn the feature on, and it has default settings. I'm going to set these to neutral to start with. And I'll go through the parameters. Okay, so threshold is your, or sensitivity is effectively the threshold above which it begins to recover the transients. Okay, so it's your dynamic parameter for how loud the information has to be in order to trigger the recovery for it, okay? And this lets you specify specific elements that you want to bring up. You may only want to bring up the most prominent high, transients and detail on a given mix, okay? So you would set a lower sensitivity for that. If you really want to dig in and recover more detail, you're going to turn this sensitivity up higher, all right? Next up, we have a crossover. So the way that Transient Guard works is it lets you frequency bias, how much recovery is happening in the highs versus the mids versus the lows, okay? Down here, we have a tilt filter that you can set either fully towards bass, fully towards high frequencies, and if you put it in the middle, you get highs, mids, and lows in equal proportion, okay? The transient crossover lets you set where the center frequency is for that tilt that goes up or up in the lows or the highs, depending on whether you're focusing on the lows or highs with the focus control, okay? So I'm going to set this to 500 because I find that when you have it at 500, it often does some nice things for the low end. And as you bring this up higher, it will better specify on higher frequencies, but you won't get as much of the dynamic and detail recovery in the low end as you might want on some stuff, okay? The only parameter I haven't talked about yet is forward. And forward is the intensity of the transient recovery. The more you turn it up, the more audible the effect becomes. Okay? So I'm going to hit play and I'm going to start turning up transient forward so you can hear the effect of what it's doing here. All right? Here we go. Without. And with. Okay. Without. And with. You hear the little details in the hi-hat and the mid-bass kind of coming back to life after we wave shaped all of them off of the signal entirely. That is sort of the idea behind Transient Guard. And it is a hybrid spectral and dynamic processor. Our IP for this is novel. We didn't rip anybody in particular off for this feature. It's homebrew, but I think it does a nice job of getting you, information back and detail that you're going to lose when you really clip and saturate the shit out of a mix, okay? So there's that. And on that note, I have talked about every parameter I've modified for this particular master. I hope you learned something. I hope you maybe enjoyed this even. I'll be back soon with another demo, and we'll keep the party rolling. All right? Peace.